Some men carry war in their eyes, not in their posture. What happens when a father's quiet dignity is mistaken for weakness? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to witness how one moment at a graduation changed everything. He hadn't even glanced at the envelope in his hand. Thomas McCoy stood straight, his posture unshaken, forged in the fires of Ramadi and Helmand, his spine aligned like a rifle ready for duty. The college-printed invitation trembled only slightly between his fingers, not from fear or age, but from restraint. The kind of restraint only someone who's buried brothers, not just memories, can understand. The two campus security guards, both younger than his last deployment, blocked the entryway with folded arms and practiced indifference. They didn't ask his name. They didn't ask if he was family. They just saw an older man in a plain suit with a high and tight haircut that never grew out right, and decided he didn't belong. "Sir, this section is for families of graduates only," the shorter one said, voice as sharp and cold as a stainless steel nameplate. Thomas held up the invitation, the edges worn from being gripped too long. "My son invited me personally. Ethan McCoy." The taller guard didn't even glance at it. "The area's full. You can view the ceremony from the overflow tent." The overflow tent, the same one tucked behind the auditorium, with the bad speakers and folding chairs sinking into lawn dirt. The kind of place you send people when you want them to be present, but not seen. Thomas didn't argue. Marines were trained to measure battles, not waste ammunition on skirmishes that didn't count. But inside something twisted. Not because he wanted a front-row seat, but because Ethan had reserved one for him. Section A, Row 3. It was written in his son's handwriting in a note tucked into the invitation. The guards didn't know that. They didn't ask. They just saw a man who didn't fit their image of family. Thomas nodded once, slow. His eyes, pale blue and war-worn, didn't flash with anger. They settled. Like ice forming over a deep lake. He turned without a word, not defeated, merely delayed. 3 steps back, then 5. He stood near the pillars by the side entrance, watching parents stream in. Some laughed, some cried, some clutched little flags and flower bouquets, and not one of them noticed the man who stood straighter than the honor guard posted at the auditorium door. 15 rows ahead, his son wouldn't know he was being blocked. He'd only see the empty chair next to his mother's and maybe think traffic was to blame. Thomas slid a hand inside his coat, withdrawing a photo. Weathered, edges curled. Him and Ethan, when Ethan was 10. The boy wore his oversized cover like a helmet, grinning through missing front teeth, while Thomas crouched behind him in uniform. The photo had survived sandstorms, ocean crossings, and 2 basements worth of mold. But here, in a college with perfect hedges and polished marble plaques, it might not survive an afternoon of indifference. Behind Thomas, whispers rose. "Is that who I think it is?" One of the voices belonged to someone who did notice. Lieutenant Commander Blake Harlow stood at the edge of the path, his dress whites gleaming in the late morning sun, medals aligned with surgical precision. He recognized the stance before he recognized the face. "McCoy," he said, stepping forward. Thomas turned slowly. "Blake." "I'll be damned," Harlow said. "What are you doing standing out here like a bouncer at your own kid's wedding?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Harlow's eyes flicked to the guards. His jaw tightened. The other men began appearing behind him like summoned echoes. Russo, Tate, McCarthy, Reed, Voss. They weren't in uniform, but you could spot them a mile away if you knew what to look for. The squared shoulders, the habit of scanning exits, the quiet way they assessed a scene before stepping in. 6 men. Not a sound, just a silence so sudden it rewrote the air. The guards looked over again. The tall one stiffened. "Everything okay here?" he asked. McCarthy stepped forward. "That depends," he said. "Is there a reason you're denying entry to a Gold Star veteran with an invitation in his hand?" The shorter guard stammered. We didn't. He didn't say. We thought. Russo cut him off. You thought wrong. Arlo stepped between them, not angry, just absolute. We'll be escorting Mr. McCoy to his seat, Section A, Row 3, make sure it's clear. It wasn't said loudly, but it didn't have to be. The air didn't carry sound, it carried presence. The kind that comes from deep-sea dives, night missions, and the memory of comrades who never made it back. The guards parted. Thomas said nothing. He only nodded again, this time to the 6 men who formed around him like a column of memory and honor. They walked together, not in parade step, not for ceremony, but because that's how you move when someone you served with has been disrespected, and silence is the only way to demand an apology no one wants to give. When they entered the auditorium, all eyes turned to them, not yet, but something in the room shifted. And Ethan McCoy, seated near the front with his program in hand, lifted his head and smiled, not because he saw his father, but because he felt him. That was how it always was. Ethan hadn't seen his father yet, but he knew he'd come. He kept checking the 3rd seat in the front row, the one he had insisted the university reserve for his dad, right between his mother and the dean's guests. For a moment he told himself it was just traffic, maybe a wrong turn, but deep down, Ethan knew his father could navigate a war zone with a compass carved into the bottom of a boot. Getting to a college campus on time wouldn't be the problem. His mother leaned in, whispering, "Have you heard from him?" "No, Mom, but he'll be here." He said it with a confidence that didn't feel like confidence anymore. It felt like hope camouflaged in certainty. On stage, the procession of faculty began filing in, and Ethan straightened in his chair. His uniform, a crisp Navy ROTC dress blue, bore only a few insignia, but it carried the weight of something greater, his father's legacy. Ethan wasn't the type to get emotional, but when he thought about what his dad had sacrificed, not just overseas, but since coming home, it made his chest swell and ache at the same time. Just then, he heard something, a subtle shift in the room's rhythm. It wasn't wow, but it was different. People started turning, some discreetly, some not. Ethan followed their gaze toward the side entrance. And there he was. Literally changed, Thomas McCoy. Not just his father, but his anchor, his shadow, his quiet force. Walking with him were 6 men, not in dress uniform, not in parade formation, but in something stronger than both. Presence. Brotherhood. They flanked him like they had rehearsed it 1,000 times, but Ethan knew they hadn't. That's what made it real. And cred. The crowd didn't understand what they were seeing, not at first. A few whispered, others nudged the people beside them. Who were they? Were they officials? Security? VI? But some recognized it, not with their eyes, but with something older. The tilt of the chin, the way Thomas walked, the steady, unapologetic pace of someone who had already earned the right to be anywhere he damn well pleased. Ethan stood without realizing he was doing it. His heart punched against his ribs, and for the first time that day, he felt still. Thomas met his son's gaze and gave a slight nod. Not a wave, not a smile. Just that small, deliberate motion they both understood. It meant, "I'm here. I never left. I always keep my word." When the group reached the 3rd row, the guests in the aisle didn't hesitate. They stood and stepped aside, some with reverence, others with silent confusion. Thomas took his seat. The 6 men behind him didn't stay. They spread throughout the room, fading into the audience, like shadows reassuming their positions after guarding a perimeter. Ethan didn't sit. He remained standing, his throat tight. The university president approached the podium and tapped the mic. "Please be seated as we begin our commencement ceremony." Ethan stayed on his feet. A few heads turned. Then he reached up and unclipped the mic from the stand without asking. He didn't look at the president. He didn't ask permission. He looked at the audience. "Before we begin," he said, voice calm but unmistakably clear, "I'd like to say something." A pause. No one moved to stop him. "My name is Ethan McCoy. Some of you may know me as a graduating cadet, some of you don't know me at all, but every person in this room should know my father." He looked directly at Thomas, who was still seated, jaw tight, unmoving. "The man right there, Master Sergeant Thomas McCoy, is the reason I stand in this uniform. He is the reason I am the man I am today." The room quieted, more than silence should allow. Ethan took a breath. "I invited my father here to sit in the family section because he is my family. He wasn't just there for me growing up, he was there for his country, again and again. He missed birthdays, Christmases, and most of my Little League games. But he came home, every time. He came home with wounds he doesn't talk about, with names he won't say out loud, with a burden he's never asked anyone else to carry." Thomas blinked once. That was all. "Today, when he tried to take his seat," Ethan continued, "someone thought he didn't belong. Someone looked at him and didn't see a father, a veteran, or a man who spent 30 years in service. They just saw someone out of place." He turned to the rows of students, families, staff, the media team recording at the edge of the stage. "So I want to be very clear. If there is one person who deserves to sit in the front row today, it is that man. And I'll gladly give up my diploma if that seat isn't his." Murmurs swelled, not with protest, but with awe. A professor in the front row stood, then another, then a woman near the back, then the room. One by one, people rose. Not a standing ovation. Not yet. But something better. Recognition. Thomas didn't rise to receive it. He didn't bow. Didn't nod. He just sat still, as if absorbing something he hadn't felt in years. Scene. Ethan handed the mic back to the stunned university president and returned to his seat, finally sitting, shoulders relaxing, eyes glassy but unbroken. The ceremony continued. Speeches were given, names called, applause followed. But something had shifted, and nobody would ever look at row 3 the same way again. They didn't clap at first, not because they didn't want to, but because something about the silence felt sacred, the kind of silence you don't interrupt, not even with applause. Then it came. 1, then 2, then the entire auditorium rising to their feet, hands meeting in unison, creating not just noise but acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need narration, the kind a man like Thomas McCoy understood better than most. Still seated in row 3, Thomas shifted only enough to glance around. His eyes moved slowly across the room, studying faces the way he once read terrain before a nighttime advance. Careful, calculating, never hurried. Some faces were red with shame. Others were wet with emotion. A few nodded in that subtle, reverent way, the look people give when they finally see something that's been there all along. To Thomas, it wasn't about vindication. It was about clarity, about his son seeing him, about the world seeing his son see him. And that, in truth, was more than he'd ever asked for. The clapping eventually faded, the air recalibrated. The university president returned to the mic, clearing his throat and attempting to find footing on the freshly shaken ground. He adjusted his glasses, glanced briefly toward Thomas, then addressed the crowd. "Well, I believe we've just witnessed something far more meaningful than any words on this stage can deliver." A soft ripple of agreement moved through the rows. The ceremony resumed, but the tone had shifted. Every name called after that felt like it echoed off new walls, as if the mortar of the room had been relaid in real time, bricks now fused with respect instead of routine. Meanwhile, backstage, 2 campus security officers stood stiffly near the side doors, trying hard not to look uncomfortable. One of them, the taller, shifted his weight from foot to foot, arms crossed, face flushed in a way that had nothing to do with heat. The other kept darting glances at the side exit, like he wanted to melt into the concrete and evaporate out the door. "You think we should say something to him?" the taller one asked under his breath. "Say what?" the other snapped quietly. Sorry we judged him by his haircut. We didn't know. Exactly. That's the problem. Neither spoke after that. On stage, graduates were crossing the platform one by one. Families cheered, flowers were held up like victory flags, and phones captured it all. Little digital trophies of a moment hard-earned. Ethan sat straighter with every name called, knowing his would come soon. His heart still drummed with adrenaline from the impromptu speech, but he had no regrets. He knew what his father had taught him. You don't wait for someone else to do what you're capable of doing yourself, and sometimes doing it first makes others brave enough to follow. Back in row 3, Thomas allowed himself one small luxury. He looked over at his ex-wife, Ethan's mother, seated beside him. She didn't say anything, but she gave him a look. Not pity, not apology, just something simple. Honest. Like old respect brushing against old wounds. He nodded once, she nodded back. When they had divorced, it had been civil, necessary. She never understood what the war had done to him, and he never expected her to. She took care of Ethan while he took care of his ghosts. That was the quiet agreement. No one ever said it, but both honored it. And yet now, as they sat side by side again, watching the boy they'd both raised walk toward manhood, it didn't feel like a fracture between them. It felt like an axis. At last, the announcer's voice echoed, graduating with distinction and honors from the Naval ROTC program, Ethan Thomas McCoy. The room didn't hesitate. Applause swelled again, fuller now, a roar instead of a ripple. Ethan stepped up onto the stage, his chin lifted, but his expression still composed. He took his diploma from the dean, shook hands, then turned toward the audience. For a moment he just looked. Then, slowly, he raised his right hand in a salute. Not to the crowd, not to the stage, to row 3. Thomas returned the salute without standing. It was cleaner than a textbook demonstration, but it held something deeper. Pride restrained behind discipline. The kind of salute you give not just to someone you respect, but someone who's earned your respect all over again. When Ethan exited the stage and returned to his seat, the student beside him whispered something, barely audible. "That was your dad, right?" Ethan nodded, eyes forward. "It's the reason I joined," the student said. "Didn't know that until today." Ethan didn't reply. He just looked straight ahead. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out into the quad like a slow-moving tide. Families reunited, hugs were exchanged, laughter flowed like it had been uncorked. But something about the way Thomas exited the building made a path open in front of him without a word. No one told anyone to step aside. They just did. Harlow and the others regrouped silently, nodding their farewells. Blake clapped Thomas gently on the back. "You good, brother?" Thomas nodded once. "Yeah, I'm good." "You did it," Blake added. "More than just showing up." Thomas gave a rare half-smile. "Just showed up the way I was trained." They both laughed, quiet and brief. Near the parking lot, Ethan finally found his father through the crowd. He walked up, shook his hand, then pulled him into a full hug. "Thanks for coming," Ethan said, voice a notch lower, not from shyness, but gravity. "Thanks for giving me a seat," Thomas replied. "You didn't need a seat," Ethan said, eyes locking on his father. "You already had the whole room." And for the first time in years, Thomas McCoy let himself believe it might be true. The post-ceremony crowd buzzed across the university courtyard, breaking into scattered huddles of family, classmates, and faculty. Laughter rose, cameras flashed, parents clung to pride like a second skin. But in the middle of it all, where the fountain gurgled quietly near the administration building, a different kind of circle was forming. Thomas McCoy stood with Ethan side by side, their silhouettes sharp against the shifting gold light. There was no fanfare around them, just the quiet recognition from those who'd noticed. A few students passed and gave nods, some muttering, "Thank you for your service," without waiting for a reply. A few parents gave long, deliberate glances, the kind people give when they realize they've made assumptions they can't take back. But that wasn't the real echo. The real echo came 30 minutes later in the reception hall. It was meant to be a simple gathering, light refreshments, name tags, some awkward mingling between ROTC graduates and university donors, the kind of room where people smiled politely and said things like, "future leaders," and "so proud." Ethan hadn't wanted to go at first. Too much small talk, too much diplomacy. But Thomas insisted. "Sometimes you have to walk into rooms like that," he said. "Not because they deserve you, but because someone else like you might be watching from the back wall, wondering if they belong." So they went. The hall was wide, all high ceilings and warm lights, with tables arranged around the perimeter like some social chessboard. There were small sandwiches, sparkling water, a podium, and more than a few looks as Thomas walked in behind Ethan. This time no one stopped him, not even a glance of hesitation. The guards from earlier, nowhere in sight. Ethan introduced him around name by name, professors, captains, guests of the board. Every handshake started the same way, a little forced, a little tight, but every one of them ended with a shift, a look, that invisible recalibration people do when they realize the man in front of them is not what they assume. Still, the most powerful moment of the night wasn't delivered by a speech. It wasn't even planned. Dean Whitmore stepped to the mic. A well-respected figure, known more for policy than poetry. She adjusted her notes, cleared her throat, and began the expected welcome remarks. She smiled through each paragraph, thanked donors, acknowledged top students, paused for applause. But then she did something no one expected. "I'd like to deviate from the prepared script for a moment," she said. Chatter quieted. "In this room we celebrate achievement, academic, civic, and military, but every achievement, especially in the ROTC program, is supported by something stronger than curriculum or training. It's supported by people." She turned slightly. "Ethan McCoy, please stand." Ethan blinked, caught off guard, but rose. A few claps followed. Dean Whitmore continued, "You spoke earlier with clarity and heart. You honored someone who many of us failed to see clearly today. I believe that deserves not only recognition, but reflection." She gestured to Thomas. "Master Sergeant Thomas McCoy," she said, her voice ringing now with a tone both reverent and sure. "On behalf of this university, and on behalf of every student who walks through these doors, I apologize. You should never have had to wait for validation, not today, not ever." Every person in the room stood. No cue cards, no hesitation. The applause swelled, and this time it wasn't just polite. It was raw. Then, from the far end of the hall, something remarkable happened. Blake Harlow walked forward. He wasn't in uniform, but his gait spoke volumes. Behind him came Russo, then Tate, then Voss, then Reed, then McCarthy. 6 men. No introduction needed. They walked not to Thomas, but around him. A slow, deliberate half-circle that faced outward. They weren't blocking him. They were surrounding him, presenting him. The room fell silent again, confused but compelled. Then Harlow spoke, his voice quiet, steady. "This man is not just a Marine. He's our Marine." Russo added, "He's the reason some of us made it back." Tate said he walked through hell so others wouldn't have to. Reed stepped forward, voice sharp and clear. "When you tried to remove him from his son's ceremony today, you dishonored more than a man. You dishonored every quiet act of courage no one sees." No one moved. Then McCarthy, who hadn't spoken all day, raised a hand and said, "Which is why we're here now, to make sure you see it." Harlow turned to Thomas. "Permission to speak freely, Master Sergeant?" Thomas gave a slight nod. Harlow stepped aside and looked out over the audience again. "Some of you may have walked in here tonight thinking you were the most important people in the room, the sponsors, the officials, the scholars. And with respect, you matter." He paused. "But not more than this man, not more than someone who bled for a flag that lets us have rooms like this. who came here today not to be honored, but to honor his son. And still, he was prepared to walk away quietly, with dignity. Silence clung to the walls. Then Dean Whitmore stepped down from the stage, walked across the floor, and offered Thomas McCoy something no guard, no stranger, no institution had offered him all day. Her hand. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, "for your service and for reminding all of us what that word actually means." Thomas shook her hand, his grip firm but not tight. And in that moment the applause returned. Not thunderous, solemn, grounded, true. Later, after the reception had ended and the room began to thin, Ethan and Thomas stepped outside into the cooling air. The sky above was streaked in fading orange, the kind of sky that never quite made it into photos. Ethan looked over. "I thought today was going to be about me," he said with a smirk. Thomas chuckled low. "It was. I just borrowed it for a second." They stood there for a moment longer, saying nothing. No medals were handed out. No newspaper photographers hovered nearby. But Thomas felt something shift. Something settle. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to prove anything to anyone. He'd simply been seen. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded invitation, the one Thomas had clung to earlier that day. "Keep this," he said. "Not because you needed it, but because they did." Thomas took it, nodded, and folded it tighter. Then he looked forward, toward the parking lot, the sky, and the future beyond both. "I'll be damned," he said. "Feels like coming home." And for the first time in a long time it truly did.